An Australian woman has had an alive and wriggling roundworm measuring 8 centimetres pulled out of her brain.
And the 64-year-old was suffering depression and forgetfulness. And when a neurosurgeon at Canberra Hospital performed a biopsy, she was shocked to discover that what she'd pulled out of the woman's frontal lobe was a living parasite usually found in pythons. Well, infectious diseases physician Dr. Sanjaya Senanyaki, who was working at Canberra Hospital, was called in to advise and says it's a warning about the danger of diseases passing from animals to humans.
When you operate on someone's brain and you take a biopsy of something, you never expect to encounter something living. So it was a big, big shock to her. We certainly know in humans there are parasites that can get into the brain, which are known parasites of human beings, but something this large, 8 centimeters, and wriggling around, and something that had never before been seen in a human being was certainly something we'll never forget. We never necessarily thought we'd be the ones to find a new infection in the world, but we certainly knew that this sort of thing can happen as human beings and animal habitats grow closer together.
Joining us live is Dr. Chris Murray, Professor of Environmental Change and Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Health, who's joining us all the way from the Gambia. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. Now, I'm going to try and pronounce the name of this roundworm. Can you perhaps help me? I believe it's called the Ophidascaris robertsi. Is that correct?
I think that's pretty close.
That's pretty close. What can you tell us about the roundworm that was found in this lady's brain?
Yeah, I mean, I was as shocked as anyone this morning when I woke up and I read my local news from Australia. I'm Australian myself, living in the Gambia, you know, when I read this story, I was, you know, it was a really good one. I shared it with colleagues and friends. The roundworm it's a type of parasite. Parasites are obviously all around us all the time, and as the infectious disease physician just said there, it's not unusual for people to pick up you know, worms and other things, and even for some of those worms to get into the brain. But this one is a species that is normally restricted to a carpet python, which is a type of snake that lives in Australia. And it's the first time that it's been found in a human host, and very dramatically being pulled out of a human brain on this occasion.
I mean, it really is extraordinary. And of course, this poor lady presented with stomach pain, cough, night sweats, and then she started to exhibit some frontal lobe symptoms. So she became forgetful, she became depressed as well. And when they did the imaging, they saw an atypical lesion in the right frontal lobe. So no one thought it was a worm, did they?
No, I think that's right. And I think if you go back to the original paper that they've released in association with this case, they did investigate other parasitic infections as well. And I think it was just because this is a sort of an accidental host in this case, that they hadn't picked up you know, a worm of this type in people, because of course it's not normally the case there. So it is a very interesting case.
And what can you tell us about the hypothesis of what actually happened? Because she said that she had never at any point come into contact with one of these carpet pythons. Is that right?
Yeah, that's as I understand it as well. She lives in an area where pythons occur. She lives in a natural area, and as I understand it, she forages for food around the local lake where she lives, and that's also where these pythons live. And pythons have a natural infection with this type of roundworm, and the life cycle of that parasitic relationship is that the python excretes the eggs in their poo, and that gets in contact with the local vegetation. This lady has come into contact with that poo and been infected by the egg, whether directly or perhaps through ingestion by not disinfecting or decontaminating that food. She's eaten it, and it's from that stage that it's developed into a parasitic infection. And it's actually probably gone through a number of stages as the parasite develops from an egg into a larvae. It can move around the body, it migrates. That's not unusual either. But that probably also explains the diversity of the symptoms and also the long-term duration of those symptoms. You know, apparently, you know, you might think disconnected, something's happening, you know, a year or two ago in some form, in some part of the body, and only eventually being really investigated and discovered what the cause is once it was causing neurological symptoms. So the worm has actually migrated through the body, through a number of different organs, and got into the brain at some part of its development.
So that's so extraordinary. So the stomach pain was probably when she ingested the parasite into the stomach. She then got the night sweat, so a fever as she tried to fight that infection. Then it migrated up into the brain, where she then got those brain symptoms. These are what we call zoonoses. So these are infections that are transmitted from animals to humans. We've seen more and more of this, haven't we? We've seen SARS and MERS and things like this. What does that say about the proximity of humans and animals and the way and our relationship with them?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's obviously a really huge and very hot topic, particularly coming off the back of COVID and other zoonoses. That was, the source of the COVID pandemic, with the reservoir of the virus causing coronavirus being in bats. And there's a lot of work around this increasing relationship or increasing impact that humans are having on the natural world. And there's lots of hypotheses and reasons to think that that is bringing people into closer contact with some pathogens and parasites that we haven't previously experienced. Now, in this case, I think it's very premature to sort of start saying that this is a direct, an example of a case like that. It could be that this is purely incidental. It's clearly a very rare infection, and there were some oddities or unique factors associated with this poor woman that was infected, including perhaps being immunocompromised, which could have allowed this infection to go much further in her system than it would otherwise have. And at this stage, it's really probably too early to start sort of casting sort of hypothesizing around specific mechanisms that indicate this changing relationship between humans and nature.
Extraordinary story, extraordinary. Thank you so much for your time. That's Chris Murray there, Professor of Environmental Change and Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Health.
Thank you, Chris.
A remarkable story, but actually what I think is fascinating, we're seeing more infections. So 30 new infections in 30 years from animals to humans. He mentioned COVID there as well, of course. That was a huge topic, as we know. And all the transmission of these diseases, even going back to HIV, for example, that came from primates.
So do we need to assess the way that we eat animals, the way that we farm animals? Now, I understand she didn't eat any of this python, but it was during the process of cooking food that she ingested the parasite.
I think also it's about the relationship with markets and live trading and all that kind of stuff. We saw there's a lot of talk about the Wuhan market, for example, and what people were buying and the conditions of those animals. And so, yeah, we need to look at our relationship with animals, I think, don't you?
Absolutely. But as far as those symptoms go, forgetfulness and depression, I think I've got a worm in my brain. I've had one in my brain for 20 years.
Well, and the other question I didn't ask, but I'm really keen to know, is how is she now? I wonder, having had that destruction of her frontal lobes, how she will recover from that.
Well, I can only hope she's doing well. And she's world famous now, to add insult to injury. She's famous for having a worm in her brain.